Hello everybody, today we're going to look at the context of the American Civil War again. This is our third video on this topic. Today we're narrowing it down. We're looking at foreign relations and geography. So we've looked at a whole range so far. We've looked at the context militarily. We looked at it in terms of the political positions of the two sides. We've looked at the finance and the economics of it all. So this is our final stage before we go on to the battles and the events of the actual war. We're looking at the relationship the Confederacy and the Union have with other countries, most importantly at this point Britain, and we're also going to focus on the role geography might play. Not really talking about them throwing colouring pencils at each other, but what we are thinking about is the size and the scale of the Confederacy, the land borders, the sea borders, all the rivers and all of that, and how that all would play its part in the war that was to come. Right, so starting off with foreign relations. Now, things on the surface look like they're going to be fairly simple. The Union is the established nation. It has embassies across the world. It has diplomatic links. You would think it is the Union that other countries are going to want to keep on side and continue their relationship with. The Confederacy doesn't seem to have a great chance in terms of it's born out of this desire to defend slavery, something which is widely condemned and considered to be a big no-no across most other countries. A lot of the other countries it traded with, most notably in Europe. So that's our initial impression, but it is more complicated than that. First of all, the division of slavery is not straightforward. There are slave states, 4 of them in the Union, as well as there being slave states in the Confederacy. So the Union at this stage in 61 can't really push forward the argument of this being slavery versus freedom, because it isn't at this point. We will see that change during the war with the Emancipation Proclamation, which has a really, really significant impact on foreign relations going forward. We also have to remember that Britain and other nations have quite happily been buying goods from the slave states, particularly cotton, but sugar and tobacco and other things as well. So this idea that there's going to be some kind of moral judgment by Britain and other European countries and go, we're not dealing with the Confederacy because of slavery, seems a little naive at this point, because it hasn't stopped them up until this point. And on that, really, the Confederacy has the goods that the Europeans want, particularly Britain. In northwest of Britain and elsewhere, you've got these huge cotton mills, completely reliant on import of American cotton. There's going to be real economic hardship. The argument had been going on between the North and the South before the war, where tariffs suited the North, who were trying to defend against British goods, whilst they didn't suit the South, that were trying to sell to Britain. Well, with the split into the two nations, that goes, and so the Confederacy can offer a kind of an economic advantage, improve things to how they had been previously for Britain by removing these tariffs in terms of their trade. Now, the other side of it, if we take the economics to put the economics to one side in terms of trade, well, Britain and others might well welcome the disintegration of the USA. So at this point, America is emerging as a power. Britain had colonies in North America and Canada. It had Canada. It was often looking to expand that. Other European nations had interests in Central and Southern America. Now the USA essentially was growing as this power. Now, if it could split north-south, it might also split east-west, and there's a whole kind of range of potential things going forward that the rest of Europe might look on and with interest. And definitely, a disintegrated America would not be the same threat or the same force that the single nation was growing to become. Now, there's a different way of looking at it, and it's a very difficult thing to do when looking at the Civil War. But if you try to take slavery out of it for a second, which I know is not really the right thing to do in terms of this, but if we look at it in terms of what the argument might have been presented at the time, the Confederacy could argue that it, as a section of a larger country, had taken a democratic vote, and there had been a series of democratic votes across the South, and had chosen to leave because they had a different identity, they had different a different view of how things should be done, and wanted to pursue different policies and a different way of life. And so, based on the vote, they've decided to leave. Now, the union is now saying forcibly, you can't go. And they are going to impose through force a situation where the Confederacy has to stay part of the union. So the Confederacy could say, well, from a democratic point of view, from a kind of moral point of view, we're in the right. Now that kind of takes out the issue of slavery, but the issue of slavery, as I said earlier, is not as 100% clear here because the union has slave states as well. One of the analogies I often use on this when I'm teaching is I might say, well, imagine Scotland had voted for independence and then the UK said, no, you can't go, and the British Army marched into Scotland to stop them going. Now, you can imagine what the reaction in the international community would have been there, and they would have leapt, I would imagine, leapt to the defence of Scotland in those instances. So the issue which they've left on, I think, really clouds the modern judgment. But at the time, it is not absolutely clear that nations wouldn't support the Confederacy. Right. So we're gonna look at Britain in particular. Now, for the Confederacy, getting Britain on side was the absolute key, because they could trade with Britain. Britain had huge industrial production, was the workshop of the world at the time. So if the Confederacy could sell them cotton and sugar and tobacco, and in exchange could pick up all the war goods, all the military items that they needed, then that would suit the Confederacy. That would give them a better chance in fighting the war. And in terms of the navy, Britain had the strongest navy in the world at the time, so they could break the blockade. They also had the biggest merchant navy in the world, so they could transport all the goods. So whilst the Confederacy might not have the ships, Britain did. The Confederacy sent over agents to try and contact sympathetic MPs and build up support in Parliament. Didn't really get hugely far with that, but they did try. They also even went as far as creating a pro-Confederate newspaper called the Index to try and promote the Confederate cause in Britain. Also, going back to the economics of it, they send purchasing agents over to buy armaments from the British. Now, the British could, as we said, have gone in and helped the Confederacy and recognised them and gone in on their side, but they were a bit worried about getting involved in a war, because if they recognise the Confederacy and they go in on their side, then this is going to mean war with the Union. There had recently been the Crimean War, which had shown the British the difficulty and cost of fighting a distant war, and there's also going to be memories going all the way back to the War of Independence, which didn't go quite so well for Britain. So ideally, Britain wants to have its cake and eat it. It wants to stay on good terms with the Union, and it also wants to be on good terms with the Confederacy, because it doesn't want to lose the trading relationship it's got with either. And also, if there's a war, there's an even greater economic opportunity for the British, because they can sell arms to both sides, and they produce a lot of them. So Britain decides to remain neutral. It doesn't formally recognise the Confederacy as a separate nation, but in May '61, it does declare the two sides as being belligerent states, meaning they are legally waging war, which conveniently means Britain can sell both sides weapons. Now, Britain probably then at the start just sits back and kind of watches what goes on, sees that there's money to be made, and the big decisions on Britain, as we're going to keep Britain out, are going to be events that happen during the war. Right, things get really tested late in '61. So in November '61, the Confederates are sending two commissioners over, one to Britain, one to France. They leave from Cuba for Europe. They're on a British mail ship, the Trent. The Trent is stopped by a US ship led by Captain Wilkes. Captain Wilkes takes these commissioners, Mason and Slidell, off the boat and essentially holds them. Britain is absolutely furious at this, prepares the fleet says it's going to stop exporting war essentials to the Union. And there's a very unhappy compromise on this. The US government doesn't apologise, but admits they committed a legal act, and the commissioners are freed. So it's all a bit on a knife edge at this point. Things will change as we go through the war, particularly once we have the Emancipation Proclamation. But Britain is really going to try and walk the line between the two sides. And at this point, this was big hope for the Confederacy that the actions of the Union in the Trent Affair might push Britain into the Confederates' arms. Right, various other bits that are going on. There is a cotton embargo. We've mentioned it before. It's not an official policy of the Confederate government, but it is kind of agreed amongst the planting class that they're going to try and starve Britain, and this is going to bring Britain to its knees. It doesn't work. It's a terrible decision. The warehouses in Britain just happened to be full of cotton because there'd been a massive boom and an overpurchase the year before, which is one of the reasons why the South had got so overconfident with the idea of King Cotton. The fact that the embargo was imposed by the Confederate States caused anger in Britain and Europe, and therefore they very happily went looking for markets elsewhere to buy their cotton, notably India. This didn't stop other trading going on, however. So the Laird brothers up in Scotland were building ironclad ships for the Confederacy, known as Laird rams. These were vessels, as the picture of one above me, which essentially had an iron ram at the front of it, which meant essentially you smashed into the side of other boats and broke their hull and sunk them. And we really are, one of the things that the American Civil War does is it really pushes naval technology to whole new levels with the ironclads. Charles Adams from the Union threatened war against Britain on the basis of these boats being sold to the Confederacy. And the British government actually goes, those ships are rather good. We like having the most powerful navy in the world. We'll buy them ourselves. There were the commerce raiders, which were Confederate warships that attacked Union merchant ships. Again, these are built by the British. What the Confederates did was, and the British did, was really quite clever here to get around the Union having a direct issue with Britain. The Britain made the basic ships. The Confederates then took the ships to other nations where they added the weapons to them, and therefore the Union couldn't go back and accuse Britain of creating naval vessels, war vessels for the Confederacy. They weren't. They were just selling them commerce boats. The Confederacy just happened to be turning them into war boats, and Britain, well, it's not our fault. One of these, the Alabama, actually sunk 64 Union ships before being sunk itself. So that is Britain playing a kind of a part in the naval war, but always managing to very, very finely walk that tightrope of neither falling down on one side or the other. Right, the geography of it all then. And there's some really important points in this, and a lot of this actually really favours the Confederacy. The Confederacy is 2 million square kilometres. Now, that is a lot of territory to have to conquer for the Union. And that's one of the big bits on this, is that it is the Union that is going to have to attack, to conquer, and to occupy. And if you're trying to do that to a country of 2 million square kilometres, that is going to be really difficult, particularly as the population is spread out enormously. The South, very notably, in what we looked at in the differences between the North and the South before the war, is largely rural. There aren't very many towns and cities. So where do you attack? How do you control the local population? So the occupation and defeat of the Confederacy is going to be a really difficult issue. It does pose difficulties, however, for the Confederacy as well. If you look at the map at the top of the screen, you see they have an enormous land border with the Union. So how are you going to defend that? Well, the short answer to that is you're not. So the Union is going to really struggle to take control of large parts of the Confederacy, but the Confederacy isn't really going to be able to stop the Union getting in. One of the bits that is really odd, particularly if you look at this on a nice big map, one of the things I try to do with my students It seems ridiculous when you're looking at America and the size of it, and you look at the Civil War, and then you go, right, one capital is here and the other capital is there, and they're just that far apart, and you go, well, surely this is going to be a really short war because you just march from Washington to Richmond or vice versa, war over. Well, it wasn't as straightforward as that, and the little diagram above me should illustrate this, is that there is just a huge series of rivers running west to east, which are going to cause an enormous difficulty. East to west, west to east. Anyway, these rivers running to the coast are going to cause an enormous difficulty for the Union, because you have to cross them all. Every crossing point is going to slow your army down. Whenever you slow an army down, then you leave it open to being ambushed, to being attacked. If you're slowly crossing a river, that makes you absolutely ideal shooting practice for the people on the other side. So this acts as a really strong defensive barrier. The other defensive barrier that they have is the Appalachian Mountains that run across the Confederacy. Again, this means you can't just travel in straight lines. You look at a map, it all looks nice and flat. It isn't all nice and flat. There are mountains, there are rivers. This is not an easy piece of land to cross. The Confederacy had railroads and roads throughout it. So even though it's going to have a smaller army, once it knows where the Union Army is going, it can transport its men and get them in place, get them ready to take on the Confederacy, take on the Union. So the Confederate soldiers can move around and get there. They're also fighting on their own land, and this is going to make a big difference. So you have Confederate troops who know every inch of the mountain or the fields or the area that they're in. They're going to be able to take up the best defensive positions. They're going to know what's around the next corner. The Union troops who are just arriving aren't. And so a defensive war is easier to fight. Fighting on your own turf, so you know it is easier to do. It also gives you an enormous motivation when you are defending your homeland, defending your own state, defending your own town, whatever that is. So we've got a variety of things that really seem to be a big problem for the Union. One thing that would have been an even bigger problem is if the 4 slave states that remained in the Union had all seceded. Essentially, that would have cut Washington off, and it would have given an 80% increase in the amount of industry that the Confederacy had. So the fact that Maryland and Delaware, West Virginia, and Missouri don't become part of the Confederacy has a really important part to play in terms of the set out of the war and the resources, and also the geography of where the capital cities are and how much threat they're under. But it's not as simple as that, because although the state stayed in the Union, not all the people did. So quite a large number of numbers in the thousands of men from the slave states that didn't secede left their states, went down into the Confederacy, and signed up for the Confederate Army. So again, it is a more complicated picture than it first looks. Now, I've mentioned several times in the videos the blockade of the South, which sounds great, and you talk about the fact that the Confederacy has very little navy and the Union has quite a big navy, and it all sounds really straightforward until you see the size of the coastline. And that enormous coastline is one of the reasons why the blockade runners have so much success, because it's a very, very difficult coastline to blockade, because it's so big. Now, had the Confederacy got stronger support from the British, or if it had a bigger navy itself, then the impact of the blockade might have been even more limited. But the blockade, a really good idea by Lincoln's, and it is effective to a degree, but there's an awful lot of coastline to be smuggling things in from. So that's a kind of a whole range of things that played their part. Right. Thank you very much again for watching. This should really help you, hopefully. Please remember to like, to share, to subscribe. Watch the rest of the videos in this series and build up your knowledge on American history. Thank you very much for watching.